I was 15 years old when I figured out how to predict the end of the world, and nobody cared. That's not self-pity. That's just what happened. I had a spiral notebook, a hand-me-down graphing calculator with a cracked screen, and 3 years of sunspot data I'd scraped off government astronomy sites and printed at the school library. I had a hypothesis, I had a formula, and I had exactly one person in my life who was qualified to evaluate it. My mother's colleague, a visiting scholar from off-world, who sat in on the advanced mathematics seminar at the community college where Mom worked the front desk. Formula wasn't complicated once you understood what you were looking at. Standard solar physics treats coronal mass ejections as chaotic events, predictable in gross statistical terms, but not in precise timing. The models the government used, the ones the power companies used, the ones the alien scientific advisory bodies had been running for 30 years, all treated the solar cycle as a probability distribution. You could say there was a 15% chance of a significant event in any given month. You couldn't say it would happen on a Tuesday at 11 in the morning. I could, not because I was smarter than the people who built those models. I want to be clear about that. I was a 15-year-old kid eating cereal for dinner in a 2-bedroom apartment because Mom picked up extra shifts. The researchers at the Heliophysics Institute had doctorates I couldn't pronounce. The Vael academic mission that operated out of the converted office park on Route 9 had been studying stellar behavior across 14 solar systems before my grandparents were born. Sure. The difference was the pattern. I'd been staring at sunspot data long enough that I started seeing something the big models weren't built to see. The models were looking for magnitude. I was looking at rhythm. There's a subharmonic in the solar cycle, a micro-oscillation that runs about 11 days beneath the main 11-year cycle, that nobody in the official literature had flagged as predictive. It showed up in the data if you looked at the right granularity, and you were willing to do the unglamorous work of cross-referencing it against geomagnetic readings from 3 separate monitoring stations. It took me 14 months to convince myself it was real and not noise. I kept detailed logs of that process because I was afraid of exactly the error I was most likely to make, seeing a pattern that wasn't there because I wanted it to be there. Human brains are pattern recognition engines. And the same faculty that makes us good at finding signal in noise makes us excellent at manufacturing signal from noise when we're looking hard enough. So I built in checks. Every time I thought I saw the subharmonic confirm itself against a historical event, I'd construct 3 alternative explanations for the same correlation and stress test them against the data. Every time the alternative explanations failed and the subharmonic held, I updated my confidence a fraction. Not a leap, a fraction, 14 months of fractions. By the end of that time, I was confident enough to do the calculation I'd been building toward, projecting the subharmonic cycle forward and identifying the next point at which it would converge with the main cycle's peak in a significant way. The answer came up on a Tuesday morning, and I sat at my desk for a long time looking at it before I wrote it down. It took about 4 more days to realize that the rhythm was about to synchronize with the main cycle's peak in a way it hadn't done in over a century, and that when it did, the coronal output was going to be extraordinary. Not a bad storm, not a rough week for satellite communications, the kind of event that fries every unshielded power transformer on the sunward hemisphere, the kind that takes a modern grid 18 months to rebuild, the kind where hospitals lose backup power after 72 hours, and people die in the dark. I wrote it up as cleanly as I could. 12 pages typed, with the formula laid out step by step and the data appendix attached. I made 3 copies. I sent one to the Heliophysics Institute. I sent one to the office of Senator Melchard, who sat on the Science Appropriations Committee, and whose website said he cared about infrastructure resilience. I brought one in person to the community college seminar, where Dr. Joanna Clark, the Vail scholar on visiting appointment, was scheduled to speak that afternoon on predictive modeling in stellar environments. I remember exactly what the Institute's automated response said. It thanked me for my interest in solar science and encouraged me to pursue my passion through their summer internship program, applications for which were due in March. I never heard back from Senator Melchard's office. Dr. Clark I met in person and I'd be lying if I said the first impression went well. She was tall. Vael are almost always tall. Something about their home system's gravity I'd read, though I'd also read that they found that observation condescending when humans led with it, so I kept my mouth shut. Skin was the gray blue of a winter sky an hour before snow, and her eyes were a deep amber that didn't reflect light the way human eyes do. They absorbed it, held it, gave it back warmer than it arrived. She dressed in a long coat the color of old paper, buttoned to the throat, and she moved through the community college hallway with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to make themselves small in spaces that weren't built for them. She was reviewing notes on a data tablet when I approached her. She didn't look up. "Office hours are Tuesday," she said. "I have 11 minutes before the seminar begins." "I'm not enrolled," I said. "My name is Riley. I'm 15. I have a formula I need someone qualified to look at." She looked up then. The amber eyes moved over me once, quickly, the way you check the sky for weather. 15, she said. "Yeah." "And what does your formula predict?" "A Class X plus coronal mass ejection, geomagnetically induced current event across the entire North American grid. I have the timing narrowed to a 72-hour window starting in 9 days." She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of dismissal. I'd learned to read that particular sentence in the 3 weeks since I'd started trying to get someone to listen. And it had a particular texture, a held-breath patience waiting for me to finish so they could get back to whatever mattered. This was different. This was the silence of someone doing math in their head. 9 days, she said, or take 18 hours on either side of my central estimate. You derived this from publicly available sunspot data and geomagnetic readings from Barrow, Fredericksburg, and Honolulu. The subharmonic convergence is in the data. Nobody's been looking at the right granularity. She held out her hand. I gave her the 12 pages. She read standing up in the hallway while students moved around us. She read all 12 pages. The seminar started without her. When she finished, she folded the papers in half and put them in her coat pocket. "Come to my office Monday morning," she said. 7 o'clock. Bring the raw data. Monday might be too late to. 7 o'clock Monday, she said, and walked into the seminar. I went home and sat in my room and tried to decide whether that was good news or bad news. Mom knocked on my door around 9 and asked if I'd eaten. I hadn't. She made eggs. We sat at the kitchen table, and I told her what had happened, and she listened the way she always listened. Without interrupting, without the particular adult reflex of finding the explanation that made everything less alarming. When I finished, she said, "Is she good at her job?" "She's one of the top 3 stellar physicists in the Vael Academic Mission's North American posting," I said. I looked her up. Mom nodded. "Then you did the right thing. Eat your eggs." I want to say that was the moment everything turned, that Dr. Clark's willingness to spend 11 minutes in a hallway, reading my formula, was the break in the dam, but that's not how it worked. I slept badly that weekend. Not from excitement. From the particular anxiety of someone who has done everything they can do and is now waiting on the outcome of someone else's judgment. The formula was either right or it wasn't. Dr. Clark was either going to confirm it or she was going to explain, precisely and without cruelty, why what I thought was signal was actually noise. Either way, I would know. The not knowing was the hardest part, which sounds obvious but is harder to live with than it sounds. I spent Saturday going over the work again, not looking for errors. I'd been over it enough times that I was past the point where going over it again was likely to catch anything new. I was just sitting with it, the way you sit with a decision after you've made it. Not because you can change it, but because the mind won't let go. Sunday, I went to the library and read everything I could find about large-scale power grid failures. Historical events. The geomagnetic storm in 1989 that took down the Hydro-Quebec grid for 9 hours. The Carrington event in 1859, which fried telegraph equipment across 2 continents and set papers on fire at telegraph stations from aurora-induced current. I read the engineering reports on transformer replacement timelines. I read the emergency management literature on cascade failures. I was building a picture of what I was trying to prevent, and I was building it because I needed to be able to speak to it, precisely if Dr. Clark's review went well and we needed to move fast. You don't get to say, it will be bad to people in positions to act. you say. 31 large extra high voltage transformers at elevated risk of permanent damage. 18 to 24-month replacement timelines at current manufacturing capacity. Estimated grid restoration costs in the $11 to $17 billion range. Projected civilian mortality if extended outages affect ICU-dependent and home oxygen-dependent populations. Numbers, specific number. I had them ready. Monday morning I brought the raw data, Dr. Clark sat across from me at a desk stacked with data tablets and paper printouts. She had a preference for paper that I found oddly reassuring, and she went through my work line by line for 3 hours. She found 2 arithmetic errors in the appendix, corrected them herself in pencil, and confirmed that the corrections didn't materially affect the output. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The subharmonic signature, she said. You identified it from visual pattern recognition of the plotted data. Yes, ma'am. Not from a Fourier analysis. I didn't have software that would run a Fourier at that resolution. I printed the plots and looked at them. She brought her gaze back down from the ceiling and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. There was something in it that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite pity. Something more complex than either. The Vael predictive array has been monitoring this system's stellar output for 31 years, she said. We run continuous Fourier analysis at 17 frequency bands. We did not identify the subharmonic you have identified. I didn't know what to say to that. There are 2 explanations, she said. The first is that your pattern is noise. A coincidental visual artifact in low-resolution, plotted data that doesn't survive rigorous spectral analysis. The second is that our array's frequency bands were selected based on prior theoretical assumptions about which oscillations are physically meaningful, and we have been systematically blind to a signal that falls between our measurement intervals. Which do you think it is? She was quiet again. Outside her office window, the morning was gray and cold, the bare trees of the campus parking lot standing like arithmetic in the fog. I'm going to run the raw data through the array tonight, she said. If the subharmonic is there, I will see it. If it is there and your convergence timing holds at this resolution, then we have a significant problem and a very short window to address it. And if the subharmonic isn't there, then I will tell you so, and I will explain exactly why the pattern you observed is a visual artifact, and you will have lost nothing except some anxiety. She said it without cruelty. Precision. I went home. I couldn't sleep. Mom sat up with me until 2 in the morning watching old disaster films on cable, the kind with obvious models and sincere acting, and at some point I fell asleep on the couch and she put a blanket over me. Dr. Clark called at 6:15 the next morning. Come back, she said. Now please. Her office was different when I arrived. The neat stacks of tablets and printouts had been pushed aside to make room for printed array outputs. Long, continuous paper rolls of spectral data that spilled off the desk and pooled on the floor. There were 3 coffee mugs at various stages of empty. She had been there all night. It's there, she said, before I was fully through the door. The subharmonic is real. It's at 0.0089 Hertz in the photospheric oscillation data. We've had 31 years of data containing this signal, and no one looked at the right frequency band, because there was no theoretical reason to expect a physically meaningful oscillation at that interval. She paused. There was no theoretical reason until your formula provided one. I sat down in the chair across from her desk. My legs felt odd. And the convergence timing, I said, consistent with your estimate. Best calculation puts peak geomagnetic induction impact at 11 days from today, within a plus or minus window of roughly 20 hours. She picked up one of the printouts, looked at it, set it down. I've already drafted a formal alert to the Vael Mission Directorate and a parallel notification to the Heliophysics Institute and the Department of Energy's Grid Resilience Office. I sent them at 5 this morning. And? The expression on her face was careful and controlled and absolutely furious underneath. The Mission Directorate has acknowledged receipt and referred the matter to the Subcommittee on Anomalous Stellar Readings for review at their next scheduled meeting. Is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Yes. The grid impact is in 11 days. I'm aware. What about the Institute? Their automated system sent a thank you note encouraging me to apply for an internship. I stared at her. She stared back. And the Department of Energy? A duty officer called to tell me that they take all grid resilience concerns seriously, and that I should feel free to submit formal documentation through their public portal, where response times average 4 to 60 business days. There was a long silence. Paper printouts shifted slightly in the draft from the heating vent. "What do we do?" I said, stood up and put on her long paper-colored coat. "We go see Senator Melchard," she said. "In person." I should explain what Marshall Pryor was before I explain what Pryor did, because the two are not separable. Pryor ran a company called Kinetic Resource Management, which was the kind of name that told you nothing about what the company actually did. What it actually did was own infrastructure. Power lines, transformer stations, natural gas pipelines, emergency grid components, backup generation facilities. In 11 states, Pryor had been paying attention to solar storm risk for years. Not because he was worried about it, but because he understood what it was worth to be the only person in the room with spare transformers when the grid went down. Class X plus event without warning would destroy maybe 40% of the large power transformers in the affected zone. Those transformers cost between $4 and $7 million each. They take 18 months to manufacture. Kinetic Resource Management had been quietly buying up surplus transformer inventory for 3 years. When I say Pryor knew the storm was coming, I mean it differently than you might think. He didn't have a formula. He didn't have a subharmonic convergence. He had consultants who had been watching the same public solar data that I'd been watching. And those consultants had told him that sometime in the next 1 to 3 years, conditions looked favorable for a significant geomagnetic event. He was positioned for a storm. He just didn't know when. When he found out that a 15-year-old kid and a Vael academic had narrowed the timing to 11 days, he understood what that meant. A warning issued 11 days in advance could be acted on. Power companies could take large transformers offline to protect them. Emergency protocols could be staged. The event could pass with manageable disruption rather than catastrophic grid failure. And if the event passed with manageable disruption, Marshall Pryor's stockpile of spare transformers was worth exactly what he'd paid for it, and not $1 more. He found out about Dr. Clark's notifications through a man named Hawthorne, who was the kind of person corporations like Kinetic kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation. I don't know exactly how Hawthorne operated. I know what he did within 6 hours of Dr. Clark's going out. The Heliophysics Institute had received a supplemental communication from someone purporting to be associated with the Vael mission, and casting doubt on the subharmonic analysis as the product of measurement error in a non-standard methodology. The Department of Energy had received a similar communication. I don't know how Hawthorne managed the mission directorate. Maybe he didn't need to. Bureaucratic inertia is its own suppressant, and a well-placed phone call to the right administrator, suggesting that a junior posting's unilateral action might embarrass the mission's relationship with federal partners, was probably sufficient. What I know for certain is that by the time Dr. Clark and I reached Senator Melchard's district office at 2 in the afternoon, Hawthorne was already in the parking lot. I didn't know who he was. He was a large, carefully groomed man in a charcoal suit standing beside a black car, and he watched us walk from Dr. Clark's car to the building entrance without moving. It was the stillness that bothered me. Not aggressive, just observational. The way you watch something you've already decided about. Senator Melchard's district director was a thin, tired-looking man named Trent, who had the particular energy of someone who had spent too many years managing the gap between what politicians say and what they do. He was polite, he offered us water, he listened to Dr. Clark's presentation with his hands folded on the desk and his face set in an expression of carefully calibrated attentiveness. When she finished, he said he would make sure the senator's science staff were alerted. Dr. Clark asked when they would review the materials. Trent said he couldn't make any guarantees about timeline, but that grid resilience was certainly a priority for the senator. Dr. Clark asked whether the senator understood that 11 days was not a timeline that admitted of committee review. Trent said he appreciated her concern. We left. In the parking lot, Hawthorne was gone, but Dr. Clark's car had a long scratch down the driver's side door that hadn't been there before. She looked at it for a moment without any visible reaction, then unlocked the car and got in. "Dr. Clark," I said. "Get in the car, Riley." I got in the car. "Someone doesn't want this warning to go out," I said. "Someone with resources and a financial interest in the grid going down without preparation," she said. She drove carefully, her hands precise on the wheel. The mission directorate's abrupt reversal was not organic. Someone contacted them. "What do we do?" She didn't answer immediately. We drove for a while in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty, that has work going on inside it. "There's a pattern here," she said finally, "and recognizing it matters as much as recognizing the subharmonic. Every official channel we approach goes quiet within hours. Someone is watching the channels. That means we need a channel they aren't watching." She paused. "I have a colleague at the Federal Research Station in Arrowwood. His name is Dr. Klein. He's been with the Geomagnetics Monitoring Program for 20 years, and he is not a man who can be easily discouraged by a phone call from a corporate lawyer." "You know him well?" "Well enough to know his professional character. Less well personally." She was quiet for a moment. "We disagreed, publicly and at length, about the validity of Vael solar modeling methodology at a conference 8 years ago. I was correct, but I was not diplomatic about it. And you think he'll listen to you now?" "I think he'll listen to the data," she said. "Ever he thinks of me." She was right about Klein and wrong about the welcome. The drive to Arrowwood took 4 hours. We went through the kind of country that exists between cities. The flattening landscape, the long straight roads between bare fields, the occasional grain elevator, standing against a winter sky like a monument to something functional. Dr. Clark drove with the same precision she brought to everything else. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the fields go by and tried to think usefully. I thought about the formula. I thought about what I'd missed in 14 months of work, what I might still be missing, whether the uncertainty window was accurate or whether I'd made a systematic error in the propagation of error itself. There's a specific anxiety that comes with having committed to a prediction. Not the anxiety of being disbelieved, which I was used to, but the anxiety of being believed and being wrong. If I was wrong, if the subharmonic was a coincidental artifact and the convergence timing was a mathematical mirage, then Dr. Clark was going to stake her reputation on a mistake made by a teenager with a cracked calculator. The panel would convene and find nothing to warn about. The power companies would spend money on protective shutdowns that weren't needed, and whatever credibility a 15-year-old without a degree had accumulated in the previous week would be gone, along with Dr. Clark's. This out loud, because I had said it all to myself already many times, and had concluded that the data was sound. But thinking it and concluding it are different from being certain, and certainty was not something I had arrived at cleanly. Around the second hour of the drive, Dr. Clark said, without preamble, "Tell me what you're worried about." I told her. She listened the same way she read, completely, without interruption, until I was done. "Fourier resolution question," she said. "Whether the subharmonic survives spectral analysis at high resolution, or whether it degrades into noise." Yes. It survived my arrays analysis. It survived at 0.0089 Hz with a signal-to-noise ratio of 11:1. That is not coincidental artifact. "I know," I said, "but you're still worried." "I'm always worried," I said. "That's how I work. I worry about the error until I can demonstrate it doesn't exist, and then I worry about errors I haven't found yet." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a reasonable methodology," she said. "It keeps me up at night." "It also produced the correct formula," she said. "Two are probably connected." The federal station at Arrowwood was a squat concrete building at the end of a 2-lane road surrounded by antenna arrays and the particular silence of places that exist to listen. By the time we arrived, the afternoon was sliding toward evening, and the light was going gray and cold. Dr. Klein met us in the lobby with the expression of a man presented with a mildly unpleasant surprise he had no way to gracefully avoid. He was 60, or near it, heavy-built, with a gray beard, trimmed close, and the careful posture of someone whose back had suffered through decades of desk work. He shook Dr. Clark's hand without warmth and shook my hand, with what I can only describe as cautious interest. The look an adult gives a kid who shows up somewhere unexpected and seems to know why he's there. You drove 4 hours, he said. The situation merits it, Dr. Clark said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me. You're the kid with the formula, he said. Yes, sir. Show me. We were there for 6 hours. Klein was not a man who asked one question when three would do. He sat across a work table from us in a room that smelled of solder and old paper and went through the formula, the raw data, and Dr. Ray. Output with the particular energy of someone who had spent a professional lifetime being wrong in careful increments and had learned to treat every new claim as an adversary that needed defeating. He would read a section, set it down, look at the wall, pick it up and read it again. He built his objections methodically and stated them out loud, and I answered each one, and Dr. Clark added the array data where the methodology needed support. He found the same 2 arithmetic errors in the appendix that Dr. Clark had found. They had already been corrected in pencil. He ran his own spectral analysis of the raw data using the station's equipment. This took 40 minutes. I watched the output come in on the monitor. I didn't have the background to read the graph the way Klein and Dr. Clark could, but I could see the shape of the signal as it resolved. There was a peak at 0.0089 Hz that stood well above the noise floor. Klein stared at it for a long time without speaking. Then he sat back from the equipment and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked in that moment much older than 60. 11 days, he said. Central estimate, Dr. Clark said. Plus or minus 20 hours. My array's been running this system for 12 years. Nothing in the output flagged this. Your array uses standard band intervals, Dr. Clark said. She didn't say it the way she would have said it 8 years ago, I think. She said it quietly. The signal is real. I don't know how long it's been in the data. I didn't know to look for it either. Klein was quiet. His eyes were on the monitor, but I don't think he was seeing the monitor. The boy's formula, he said. He derived the frequency interval empirically. No theoretical basis, just pattern recognition from plotted data. Yes, Dr. Clark said. And the Vael array confirmed it. Yes. Klein was quiet for another moment. Through the window of the room, I could see the antenna arrays standing in the last light of the afternoon, their geometry stark and purposeful against a sky that had gone the color of old brass. The standard channels are plugged, he said finally. You said the mission directorate reversed. Within 6 hours, its notifications going out, Dr. Clark said. Heliophysics Institute. Effectively non-responsive. Melchard's office. Procedural sympathy and no action. Klein nodded slowly. He looked at me. You understand what we're talking about, he said. It's not a question. Yes, sir, I said. If the warning doesn't go out in the next 3 or 4 days, there's not enough lead time for the power companies to take the large transformers offline. You need at least 72 hours minimum to do a coordinated protective shutdown of the critical components. 96 to be safe. You've done your homework, he said. I spent Sunday at the library reading grid failure engineering reports. Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly. Something more like respect. And someone is blocking the warning, he said. Yes, sir. He looked at me for another long moment. Then he stood up and went to a cabinet on the wall and took out a phone, a landline, the kind that doesn't connect through anything that lives on a network, and made a call. I found out later that the call was to a man named Coach Corey, which is not what it sounds like. Corey was Klein's brother-in-law, a former military logistics officer who had transitioned into federal emergency management, and who had, over the course of a 20-year career, developed the particular set of relationships that exist between people who deal with actual emergencies, rather than the bureaucratic representation of emergencies. He knew people at the Department of Homeland Security who were not on Pryor's radar. He knew the duty officer for the National Grid Resilience Protocol who had been waiting his entire career for someone to call him with a genuine emergency rather than another drill. The call lasted 40 minutes. When Klein came back to the work table, his expression hadn't changed, but something behind it had. There's a federal briefing process, he said. Emergency Scientific Advisory Panel. It exists for exactly this kind of situation. A credible threat with a closing response window. It bypasses the standard departmental channels. I've requested an emergency convening. He paused. They need a formal scientific certification. credentialed scientist willing to put their name on the prediction. He looked at Dr. Clark. She looked back at him. Your credentials outweigh mine, he said. Your Vael mission faculty. Your certification would carry more weight with the panel. I've already been publicly contradicted by my own mission directorate, she said. I know. A certification from me in this context may be dismissed on the grounds that my methodology has already been challenged by my own superiors. I know that too, Klein said. Question is, whether you're willing to stake your standing on this. There was a silence in the room. The antenna arrays outside had gone dark against the evening. The overhead lights hummed faintly. I want to tell you that what happened next was simple. That Dr. Clark looked at the data and looked at Klein and said yes, of course, because the data was clear and the right thing was obvious. It wasn't simple. I was there and it wasn't simple. Because what Klein was asking her to do was not just sign a document. Her mission directorate had already effectively repudiated her analysis. A formal certification submitted to a federal emergency panel over her directorate's implicit objection was a career-defining act. If the storm hit as predicted, she was vindicated. If the storm didn't hit, or hit outside her window, or hit without the grid impact she predicted, she was finished. Not just at the North American posting, but in the broader Vael academic structure, which had very long institutional memory and very little patience for scientists who went around their own administrative structures to alarm foreign governments. The Vael do not proceed recklessly. It is not in their character. Their academic tradition is built on the understanding that individuals operate within institutional structures for good reasons, and that unilateral action, however well-intentioned, erodes the trust those structures depend on. Dr. Clark knew this. She had built her career within those structures. She had, by her own accounting, been too aggressive in public disagreement once before, and had spent 8 years in the professional shadow of that choice. She had been staring at the data for 36 hours. She had not slept. The amber eyes were steady, but there were lines around them that hadn't been there 2 days ago. The subharmonic is real, she said. It wasn't to Klein. I don't think it was even to me. It was the way you say something when you need to hear yourself say it out loud, in your own voice, to test whether it holds. The convergence timing is consistent across 2 independent analytical methods. Formula is sound. She picked up her pen. She signed the certification. Hawthorne found us 4 hours later. Don't know exactly how. Whether someone at the federal station was on Pryor's payroll, or whether Hawthorne had simply been tracking Dr. Clark and following at a distance, or whether the emergency panel convening request itself triggered some alert he'd been watching for. What I know is that we came out of the station at 9:30 at night to find 2 large men standing beside Dr. Clark's car and Hawthorne standing 20 feet away with his hands in his overcoat pockets. He didn't threaten us. He was too careful for that. He said that he represented a private client with significant interests in the energy sector, and that his client was concerned about the potential for public panic resulting from an imprecise or premature warning, and that there were resources available to ensure that any legitimate scientific concerns were addressed through proper channels, which would, of course, take some time. Dr. Clark looked at him the way she looked at things she was analyzing. Steady, precise, not hostile. How much time? She said. These things can't be rushed, Hawthorne said. Science requires peer review. The event requires 72 hours of lead time for protective grid action. We have 7 days before that window closes. I'm sure there's room for a proper process. There isn't, she said. And you know there isn't. He didn't say anything to that. In the parking lot light, his face was carefully neutral, the face of a professional who understands that expressions are information and declines to offer them. Move away from the car, please, she said. One of the large men took a step forward. Not aggressive, just present. I was 15. I want to be accurate about what I contributed in that moment, which was, I stood very still and tried to look like someone who was not afraid, which is different from not being afraid. I was afraid. The parking lot had one working light, and the night beyond it was very dark, and the men were much larger than either of us. And I was suddenly aware that I was the kid with the formula in a parking lot at 9:30 at night with people who had financial motivation to make the formula go away. What happened next is something I have thought about many times since. Dr. Clark reached into her coat pocket and took out her data tablet. She didn't take out a weapon. She didn't raise her voice. She opened the tablet and showed Hawthorne the screen. This is a copy of Dr. Klein's emergency panel convening request, she said. And this is a copy of the formal scientific certification I've submitted. Both are already in the federal system. Removing us from this parking lot does not remove them. Hawthorne looked at the screen. Something moved behind his eyes. Additionally, she said, I have transmitted a full copy of the raw data, the formula, the array analysis, and my certification to 6 members of the Vael Academic Mission's Independent Review Board, with a message explaining that if I do not contact them within 24 hours with a status update, they are to forward everything to the senior Vael diplomatic representative in Washington. She paused. I sent that transmission 40 minutes ago. The large men looked at Hawthorne. Hawthorne looked at Dr. Clark. You should move away from the car, she said again. They moved away from the car. We drove. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The highway was nearly empty. At that hour, the overhead lights strobing past in a steady rhythm, and I watched them go by and tried to get my heartbeat back to something normal. When did you send it? I said finally. The transmission to the review board. Just before we left the building, while you were in the bathroom. I sat with that for a while. You were ready for him, I said. I assumed someone was watching, she said. When your mission directorate reverses a formal notification in 6 hours, and a government official's office fails to act on a clear time-sensitive warning, and a rental car develops a spontaneous scratch in a public parking lot, the pattern is not subtle. You're calm about it. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not calm, she said. I'm controlled. Those are different things. She drove for another mile before she spoke again. The Vael are taught, from the beginning of our academic training, that the individual operates within institutional structures because those structures represent the accumulated judgment of many minds over many years. We are taught to be cautious of the individual who believes their own assessment outweighs the institution's. History has many examples of catastrophic errors made by individuals certain of their own correctness. And, I said, and I am certain of my own correctness, she said. That is not a comfortable position for a Vael scholar to occupy. It requires careful handling. Because you might be wrong. Because I am not constructed to be comfortable being certain. The discomfort is the check. She paused. Your formula is sound. I have verified it against independent data from 2 monitoring systems. The subharmonic is real. The convergence timing is consistent. I am certain because the evidence is sufficient for certainty, not because I want to be right. She said it the same way she'd said it in Klein's office. The way you say something when you need to hear yourself say it. The Emergency Scientific Advisory Panel met the following afternoon. I was not in the room. I was 15. And whatever latitude the panel was willing to extend to an unusual situation, they weren't going to seat a teenager at a federal advisory table. I sat in a waiting area outside the meeting room, with a cup of bad coffee that I was probably too young to be drinking, and a copy of my formula that I no longer needed to review because I had memorized it. Mom was there. Klein had called her the night before. I hadn't, because I hadn't wanted to worry her, which was foolish of me, and she made clear without raising her voice that it was foolish of me. She sat beside me in the waiting area with her hands around her own coffee cup and didn't tell me everything would be fine. I loved her for that. Adults who tell you everything will be fine in situations where they cannot know that are trying to manage their own fear, not yours. Mom was afraid. She sat with it the same way she sat with everything hard, directly without flinching away. She asked me questions about the formula, and I answered them, and she followed the math, as far as she could follow it, and then she asked me to explain the rest in plain language. And I did. When I finished, she said, and this woman, doctor, she knows her stuff. She's one of the best in her field, I said. Then you did your part, she said. Now you wait. The panel met for 3 hours. During those 3 hours, we later learned, the following things happened. Pryor's legal team submitted 2 formal objections to the panels convening on procedural grounds. Both were reviewed and denied. A representative from the Heliophysics Institute attended and initially challenged the subharmonic analysis on the grounds that it had not been independently replicated, at which point Klein's 12-year dataset was introduced, showing the signal at 0.0089 Hz across the full recording period. Representative asked for time to review. The panel chair told him time was the central problem. Dr. Clark testified for 90 minutes. I know this because she told me afterward. Not because I was there. She told me that the panel chair, a woman with the particular exhausted precision of someone running an emergency on insufficient sleep, asked her directly whether she was confident in the prediction. Dr. Clark said she was confident in the formula, confident in the data analysis, and confident in the convergence timing within the stated uncertainty window. The panel chair asked whether she understood that she was contradicting her own mission directorate. Dr. Clark said she understood that her mission directorate had been contacted and improperly influenced before reviewing the evidence, and that the evidence itself had not materially changed. The panel chair asked whether she was staking her professional standing on this. Dr. Clark said she already had. They issued the warning at 4:17 in the afternoon. Not a public alarm, not yet. Formal notification to the major regional grid operators and the Department of Energy's Grid Resilience Office, with a protective action advisory attached. The advisory recommended voluntary protective shutdown of large unshielded transformers in the high-risk zones, beginning no later than 72 hours before the predicted peak event window. Some operators acted immediately. Some waited. Some called their lawyers. I'm not going to tell you the warning worked perfectly, because it didn't. We got it out with 6 days to spare before the predicted window, which sounds like plenty of time and wasn't, because the machinery of large-scale infrastructure protection doesn't move at the speed of urgency. It moves at the speed of liability and procurement and shift schedules, and the specific human resistance to doing an expensive and disruptive thing, because someone told you something bad was going to happen. The operators who acted immediately had their critical equipment offline within 48 hours. The ones who called their lawyers spent 2 of their 6 days in conference calls, and then spent the next 2 days scrambling to implement in half the time. I spent those 6 days in a particular kind of suspended state that I've never been able to fully describe to anyone. The warning was out. The formula had been certified. There was nothing more I could do except wait and watch the weather. Mom went back to work. She couldn't afford to take a week off, and there was nothing she could do by staying home that she couldn't do by being available by phone. She called twice a day. The calls were short. She asked if I was eating. I told her I was. She told me to actually eat and not just tell her I was eating. I ate. Klein stayed at the station, monitoring. He called me the second morning to tell me that he'd verified the subharmonic signal against a third dataset. Historical readings from the Barrow station going back 22 years, and that it was present throughout, consistent, and had been increasing in amplitude over the previous 8 months exactly as the formula predicted it would as the convergence approached. He said this not as reassurance but as a data report. I appreciated that. Dr. Clark went back to her office. She told me she was working on a formal paper documenting the subharmonic discovery and its predictive implications. I asked her if she wasn't waiting to see whether the prediction held before publishing. She said waiting would imply she had doubts she didn't have. Senator Melchard's office issued a statement 3 days after the panel's warning, supporting appropriate monitoring of solar weather events and encouraging responsible preparation. Trent had apparently spent 48 hours negotiating the wording with someone. I read it twice, trying to find something actionable in it, and gave up. Pryor's company filed an injunction attempting to block the warning's distribution to grid operators. The injunction was denied inside of 6 hours by a federal judge, who, based on the reported opinion, had very little patience for the argument that a solar physics warning constituted unfair market interference. I heard about this from Klein, who reported it with the exact same tone he used to report monitoring data. The nights were hard. I had finished every piece of work I could do. There was no further analysis to run, no additional verification to seek. The formula was in the federal system and in the scientific record and in the operational plans of grid operators across the region. The only thing left was for the storm to arrive or not arrive, on time or off, with the predicted intensity or without it. I watched a lot of weather. There are publicly available monitoring feeds, satellite data, geomagnetic index readings from ground stations, Solhear wind velocity measurements from the Deep Space Monitoring Network. I had bookmarked them all. In the 4 days before the predicted window, I sat at my desk and watched the numbers with the particular focus of someone who has staked everything on an outcome and can't look away. The subharmonic signature was building. I could see it in the data as the convergence approached. The oscillation's amplitude growing as the two cycles came into alignment, the way harmonics reinforce each other when their frequencies lock. It was the most beautiful and terrible thing I had ever watched. On the 9th day, the numbers broke. Coronal mass ejection index spiked at 0347 hours. I had not slept more than 4 hours a night for most of the previous week, and I watched the satellite feeds register the wavefront propagating outward from the solar surface. The magnetometer readings at the 3 ground stations I'd been monitoring began their characteristic swing. The slow precession that meant geomagnetically induced current was building in the long conductor infrastructure beneath the ground. There is a particular feeling that comes with being right about something you've been afraid you were wrong about. I've tried to describe it to people, and I've never gotten it quite accurate. It isn't relief, exactly, though relief is part of it. It isn't triumph. It's something closer to the feeling when the last number in a long equation resolves correctly. A sense of the world snapping into alignment with the math, which is either reassuring or frightening, depending on how you feel about math being in charge. I called Dr. Clark. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had also been watching the feeds. It's consistent with the predicted timing, I said. Yes, she said. Solar wind velocity is tracking the upper bound of the induction curve. Is that good or bad? It means the event will be at the high end of the predicted intensity range. The transformer operators who haven't finished their shutdowns. Yes, she said. I know. We stays on the phone for a while without talking, which sounds strange but wasn't. There was nothing more to say. The storm was arriving. Preparation that had been done was done, and the preparation that hadn't been done, and the next 14 hours would be the accounting. It hit in the middle of the window I'd predicted, 10 hours before my central estimate, which was within the stated uncertainty bounds. The storm lasted 14 hours at peak intensity. Watched the geomagnetic index reach levels I had calculated, but part of me had not entirely believed were possible. The raw numbers, when the scientific community analyzed them afterward, were the highest recorded since instruments capable of measuring them had existed. In the zones where the protective shutdowns had been completed, the grid held. There were localized outages from smaller components that hadn't been prioritized. Distribution transformers, substation equipment below the critical threshold list. There was disruption, but the backbone held. In the zones where the shutdowns hadn't been completed in time, the damage was significant. 31 large extra high voltage transformers destroyed. 3 regional grids down for extended periods. The reconstruction costs, when the accounting was done, ran into the billions. People died. I want to say that plainly because it is the plain truth, and it deserves plainness. In the areas that lost grid power for extended periods, people dependent on electrically powered medical equipment died when backup generators ran out of fuel. Not many. The warning had been early enough that emergency services had time to stage resources and prioritize the most vulnerable. But some. The number that sticks in my memory is 11. 11 people who would have survived if the grid had been fully protected. I've been asked, over the years, whether I think about those 11 people. The answer is yes. I think about them the way you think about an arithmetic proof that has an error in it. Not with grief that goes away, but with a specific, located understanding of where the system failed and why. The system failed because prior bought time. Not enough time to stop the warning entirely, but enough to erode the lead. Clark's first notification hadn't been interfered with. If the mission directorate hadn't been contacted, if the Heliophysics Institute's duty officer hadn't received that undermining communication. If Trent in Senator Melchard's office had picked up the phone instead of offering procedural sympathy, the warning could have gone out 2 days earlier. 2 days earlier, and the protective shutdowns would have had time to complete. 11 people who died in the dark might not have. Pryor's stockpile of spare transformers turned out to be useful after all, but not in the way he'd planned. The federal government invoked emergency acquisition authority and purchased the inventory at regulated cost. He did not profit from the event the way he'd intended to, and I'm told he considered this a significant injustice. I don't know how to feel about the fact that the system, such as it was, eventually worked, eventually, imperfectly, at a cost that didn't have to be paid. I was 15. I worked that problems as hard as I knew how to work it, and I found someone who knew how to take what I'd found and put it into a form the world could act on. And she had the particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. The courage of signing your name to something when the signing costs you. The courage of sitting with certainty when certainty is uncomfortable, because the evidence demands it. The Mission Directorate Subcommittee in NAMA Readings convened their review meeting 3 weeks after the storm as scheduled. The agenda item on the subharmonic convergence formula was discussed for 1 hour. The committee formally acknowledged that Dr. Clark's analysis had been correct, and that the initial reversal of her notification had been premature. I'm told she received this news with minimal visible reaction. The formula is in the literature now. It has a name. The formal name is the Subharmonic Convergence Predictive Model, which is accurate and completely unglamorous, and it's been incorporated into the Vael Arrays Monitoring Protocol and into the Heliophysics Institute's Standard Analysis Suite. The 11-day prediction window has been validated against historical data going back 60 years. There were 3 events in the historical record that the model correctly retrodicts, and that the existing models had classified as unpredicted anomalies. They gave me an internship, the Heliophysics Institute. I declined. The last time I talked to Dr. Clark about any of this, she asked me whether I'd been afraid. In the parking lot, when Hawthorne and his men were between us and the car, told her yes. She said that was appropriate, that the situation warranted fear. I asked her if she'd been afraid. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was doing math in her head, and then she said, I was afraid that the formula was wrong. From the moment you showed it to me in the hallway, the fear that I was about to certify an error in front of a federal panel and cause an expensive and disruptive false alarm, that fear did not leave me until the first geomagnetic reading came in and matched the predicted induction curve. I told her I'd had the same fear. She looked at me with those amber eyes that absorb light and give it back warmer. I know, she said. That's why I believed you. I've thought about that a lot since. What it means. That the fear of being wrong is different from the fear of the consequences, and that sometimes the right signal is the person standing in front of you who is afraid for exactly the right reasons, not afraid of what happens to them. Afraid that the thing they're certain about might not be true. She staked everything on 11 days, and a formula a 15-year-old had worked out on a cracked graphing calculator. She did it because the data was sound, and because she understood, in a way that the committee and the institute and the senator's office did not, that a closing window doesn't wait for institutional comfort. It doesn't wait for the subcommittee's scheduled meeting. It doesn't wait for peer review to run its normal timeline. It closes, and what you didn't do in time stays not done. She went back to her posting, and her data tablets, and her preference for printed paper, and her long paper-colored coat. The Mission Directorate did not censure her. They did not commend her either. She was, as far as I know, simply there, doing the work the same as before. I kept the formula in a spiral notebook, the original one with the data appended, and the 2 pencil corrections in her handwriting in the margins. The corrections are in a precise, slightly angular script. The letters formed with the care of someone who learned to write in a script not built for their hand. The notebook is on my desk right now. It has been on my desk, in one apartment or another, for a very long time. Some mornings, I look at it and think about 11 people in the dark. Some mornings I think about the 60% of transformers that came offline in time, and the grids that held, and the hospitals that kept their lights on. Most mornings I think about a tall woman in a hallway with 11 minutes before a seminar, reading 12 pages she didn't have to read, choosing to stay in the hallway instead of walking into the room where her colleagues were waiting. That choice saved lives. Not the formula, not the panel, not the warning. The choice, and what she decided it was worth, and the specific quality of silence that followed when someone capable finished reading something true and decided to do something about it. I was 15 years old when I figured out how to predict the end of the world, and one person listened. That turned out to be exactly enough.